Good evening from Singapore. It's now 8 o'clock, or at least just after. You're at the right channel. This is Blockchain and the History of the Future with a question mark, because we are exploring what the potential of blockchain and NFT brings to the culture sector. This webinar is brought to you by YLab at National Gallery Singapore. Just a quick preamble. YLab is a startup accelerator here at the gallery because we believe in trying to figure out a possible technological future that can support the art and culture sector. We're interested in this, and therefore we are exploring different thematic elements within the tech domain. So this is the very first inaugural session of a three-part series focusing on the potential of NFT for art and culture. Today, we are very happy to have Kathleen Dixit to actually host this session. She is a curator here at National Gallery Singapore, and she specializes in art, the history of art and technology. She's assembled a fantastic cast of experts and speakers from all over the world to really enlighten us on the possibilities. If you wish to know more, do visit us at ylab.sg. But for now, I'd like to make sure that when you watch this show, be aware of certain disclaimers that we have to put up. NFT is a very interesting topic, but also very misunderstood, and which is why I need to read back to you some of the disclaimers I want to share here. The speakers today are not registered financial or investment advisors. All opinions here are the speakers alone. Nothing to be discussed today should be relied upon as financial or investment advice. Okay. The webinar is solely for informational and educational purposes only, and if you do want to treat it as a financial asset or tool, do consult with your financial or investment professionals. Now with that, let's focus on the matter at hand to explore the potential of NFTs. And so we will now hand over to Kathleen Dixit to take the show on the road.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening or morning or wherever you are. As Kevin has shared, tonight's panel, Blockchain and the History of the Future with a question mark, kicks off our series on Beyond NFTs, 3 panels that are considered response to the hype around NFTs as a revolutionary trading tool for art and digital assets. Beyond NFTs reflects upon how we write history, how we find value and communities, and how we understand ourselves as being part of a public, and how these ideas are shifting or may shift in relation to the risks and opportunities that NFTs and other blockchain technologies offer. Tonight's panel considers the root function of blockchains as digital ledgers and what they offer the future of writing history in promising more publicly constructed and sustained databases of information that are beyond the purview of state censorship. We also consider how blockchain technology can be used to record and make tangible the subjective values that individuals tie to specific museum collections. How then does the blockchain change the way we think about provenance or how we understand a specific moment in history? To help us think through these questions, we are joined today by Sam Williams, CEO of Arweave, and Francis Lytle, a researcher, writer, and advisor working at the intersections of cultural institutions, arts, and Web3. I will introduce Francis in greater detail before her presentation. Today's panel will consist of 2 presentations and a question and answer session after. You may post your questions on YouTube chat. We'll be able to receive that during the presentation, but we will answer your questions later. So thank you for your patience. So we begin today's panel with a presentation by Sam Williams, who is the CEO of the company that created the Arweave protocol, a permanent archive of human knowledge and experiences on a blockchain. Sam is passionate about building innovative software, solving complex problems in distributed computer networking, and has extensive experience in real-world mechanism design and implementation. Besides his activities at Arweave, Sam actively participates in the decentralized web space as technical advisor and mentor of blockchain projects. For our audience benefit, Arweave is a global permanent hard drive built on 2 novel technologies, the block weave, a derivative of the blockchain, and proof of access, a custom incentivized proof of work algorithm. It promises to provide truly permanent data storage at a massive scale. Forbes has actually described our weave as a Noah's Ark for documents, a perfect preservation for future historians and researchers. On that note, over to you, Sam.
Amazing, thank you for having me. So yeah, I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen, please? Can you see?
Yeah, it's perfect. We see you clearly.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to start this talk by going from sort of super high level. So what is a blockchain? And then we can get into a little bit more detail about why I think it's interesting from an archival point of view and how Arweave fits into that. So I'm from as you heard from the introduction, from a technical background. I was building distributed operating systems for my PhD before I started Arweave. So I will try and keep it as high level as possible, but there will be some technical details along the way. I hope that it's understandable. So what is a blockchain? At a simple sort of functional level, rather than at a implementation level, it's a decentralized ledger without a single point of failure. So the idea is to replicate a piece of information around the world and have a certain set of rules about adding new information. The first use for a blockchain was Bitcoin, which is essentially a digital store of value, if not currency. The simple function it's attempting to provide is a way of allowing people to have ownership of an asset that does not inflate at any single individual's desire. So the idea is there should only be 21 million Bitcoins, no matter what happens in the future, and no single person has control of it. The way that they achieved this was essentially replicating a ledger of ownership around the world without a single centralized point failure. This is pretty interesting, I think, to us in the archival space, because what you've created, more or less, is a censorship-resistant archive, one way or another, of information that is replicated around the world in so many places that it can't be lost, or it'd be extraordinarily difficult for that information to be lost. And this sort of use of blockchain was actually, arguably, the first use of blockchain before even as a financial ledger, because Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009, when they minted the first Bitcoin block, they embedded this message, which was the headline of the Times on the 3rd of January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout of 4 banks, which is pretty interesting. I think that the originator of blockchains, Satoshi Nakamoto, who remains unknown who that actually is, it's a pseudonym, must have had in their mind that you could use the network for this type of thing. And of course, another really interesting part of this from the point of view of archives is that information stored inside blockchains is buried under a huge amount of what we call proof of work. That is essentially a mathematical or cryptographic guarantee that a certain amount of energy has been expended in order to produce the blocks. And as time goes by and new blocks, and a block is essentially just a group of transactions or interactions with the network written as one chunk, written in one go. As time goes by and these blocks are added, the amount of work that a previous transaction or interaction with the network is buried under increases. And you can see here that now Bitcoin uses an extraordinary amount of energy. So to rewind time, if you will, and remove a piece of information from this ledger is, virtually impossible after just a few days. The cost of doing so would be inordinately expensive. And so what you end up with is a censorship-resistant ledger of information that is spread across the world in a way that doesn't have a single centralized point of failure. It's a pretty interesting idea. So there's a fundamental problem with that, though, which is that it doesn't scale to store huge amounts of information. So as we saw when Satoshi was embedding this headline in the blockchain, well, they didn't embed the whole article, with a nice image or what have you. They just embedded the headline. And the reason for that is because blockchains in their initial implementation were extremely inscalable from the point of view of data storage. You can only put a very, very tiny amount of information in the chain itself, which is a pretty big limitation. So when we were starting Arweave about 5 years ago, we were looking at the world and we were seeing that essentially, I mean, this is an opinion. You don't have to agree with it, but this was our motivation one way or another. We saw that geopolitical instability was rising, and the likelihood of authoritarian states emerging in the West appeared to be increasing slightly. Actually, not slightly, very significantly. And I'm 29 now, and I hadn't seen anything like this in my lifetime. And I was working in distributed operating system design. I'd been watching blockchain since late 2010-ish, something like that. And so I had in the back of my mind, well, there's one thing we might be able to do to just make it ever so slightly harder to put in place one of the important parts of authoritarian control, which is control of understanding of the past. As Orwell put it, the person that controls the present controls the past. By controlling the past, you control the future. It's a slight paraphrasing, but that was the broad principle he was trying to get across. And I figured, well, okay, so we got these blockchain things. They can make it so that really it's extraordinarily difficult for one government or group of people of any kind to censor the past. But can we scale it up? Can we make it so that you can fit extremely large amounts of information inside? And that was the mission we set about achieving. Idea there is to build essentially a new Library of Alexandria inside one of these networks, impervious to fire, flood, or typically government damage over extremely long periods of time. So how do you do that? Well, the first, you have to solve a technical scalability problem. So you have to make it so that you can fit extremely large amounts of data in the chain itself, rather than, some solutions have referred to what we call a hash, which is essentially a hash you can think of as a unique identifier, so a unique number that is related to a piece of data. And if you store one of these hashes inside a blockchain, then if you have that data still, you can verify with this proof of work system that it hasn't changed over a long period of time. But you can't make sure that the data is available. So we wanted to really put the data inside the network itself and make the data replicate with the network. So when people had copies of this ledger, they actually stored the data. And then this sort of uncovers really and makes more important a second problem, which is permanent storage sustainability. So with a blockchain like Bitcoin, it only adds 1.2 approximately megabytes per 10 minutes to the blockchain at any point in time, and that never changes. It's a protocol rule. But the problem here is that it just grows indefinitely, and there's no incentive for people to store it, technically speaking. They want to minify the amount of data they store if they run a what's called a node in the network. So these nodes are paid the token in the system, in that case Bitcoin, in order for taking part in this proof of work game that I described. But when they do so, they only want to really store like the minimum amount of information as possible. So there's no incentive to replicate that data, and it's an ever-growing data set, which is a pretty nasty problem. Well, with Arweave, we made that problem like 100 or 1,000 times worse in some sense, because we made it so that you can fit extremely large amounts of information inside the system. Well, how are you then going to support it? It just, becomes an enormous burden. That's not going to work. So we created an endowment, but I'll get into that in a moment. So from a scalability point of view, I won't go into the details here because it's extremely technical, but we essentially created a new mining algorithm that replaces the proof of work part of Bitcoin that essentially just burned energy with the replication of information stored inside the network. The idea here is that you can exchange. So one way or another, in order for a blockchain to be properly decentralized, it has to have this, it has to have either a work component or some sort of value lock of finance over time. But that's a separate topic called proof of stake that I don't think we should get into today. But for our purposes, you have to have some sort of system whereby the people taking part and receiving a reward do something that is difficult. Well, we change that difficult thing from guessing random numbers using extraordinary amounts of energy to replicating the data set inside the system. And then from a sustainability point of view, we changed the business model to be what we call a decentralized endowment. Sorry, I've got the British spelling, not the American one here. But the basic principle here is that when you put data into the network, you pay for 200 years worth of storage of that data at present storage prices. As the price of storage decreases over time, that 200 years extends out. So in a given year, you might use, or the cost of storage might decline at a rate of 10%, say. The typical rate over the last 50 years, and actually arguably over the last 1,000 years, although it came in different forms, is around 30.5%. So we expect a rate of 0.5%. If it's over 0.5%, then you end up with more storage purchasing power at the end of the year than you did at the start. Imagine, a year where there's only 10% storage cost decline. You start with 200 years at the beginning of that year, and by the end of the year, you've got 200 multiplied by 110%, so 1.1, or 220 minus 1 year that you've actually spent. And so your storage purchasing power has gone from 200 years to 219 years. There's two components to how this cost of storage decline system works. The first, well, the key metric is what we call the price per gigabyte hour. What is the price of storing a gigabyte of data for an hour? This is a slightly simplified equation here, but it shows the basic principle, which is that there's two major components to this. So there's the hard drive size and the mean time between failure of hard drives. You can think, how long does the hard drive live, basically? And if you increase either of these components, the price per gigabyte hour decreases. So we've looked into a little bit of the future hard drive cost decline expectations that the industry has, but more interestingly, where the limits of this are. So how long does the cost of storage decline for? And we found that just on the size part of this, so on the bit data density, the number of bits you can express in a single cubic centimeter, we are operating right now in production at 1 times 10 to the power 12 or 1 times 10 to the power 13 bits per cubic centimeter. And the theoretical data density maximum is something like 1 times 10 to the power 67, I believe. So there's, even with exponential growth, there's an extremely long way to go. That's about 430 years approximately of 30% storage declines per year just on that factor before you reach the end of that, I guess, scale. And then on the other side, there's mean time between failures, so the lifetime of a hard drive. It's actually much harder to define limits of that. So we know that there should be some limits from entropy theory and physics, but they're way, way further out into the thousands of years from where we are here. So when you add up this system, we think it's a fairly reasonable assumption to make that at least for the next hundreds to thousands of years, there will be a cost of storage decline over 0.5%. And subsequently, the rate of increase in storage purchasing power at the end of each given year, or not necessarily each given year, but an average given year, will be higher than it was at the start. That's essentially how the storage endowment works in the system. Okay, so we built that. That's called Arweave. Well, there's this layer on top of it called the permaweb. That's essentially everything everything that is stored inside Arweave made available in people's web browsers. Or another way of thinking about it is a global permanent web. We think that the web in its first iteration was essentially trying to create this. It was a distributed knowledge base. But as we know, the web has unbelievable amounts of link rot, as they call it. So you might link from one piece of knowledge to another piece of knowledge, but that other piece of knowledge might not be there anymore. There's dreaded 404 page, right? Well, we think that by baking memory into the protocol itself, you can make a better form of the web. One thing that's pretty interesting about this approach to archiving that is different, I think, from a traditional structure is that it's permissionlessly writable. So that is, anyone can come along, and if they're willing to pay for the cost of storage, and that cost is, it's not actually too expensive, it's about 0.7 to 0.9 cents per megabyte. So you don't necessarily want to store huge 4K videos of like what we would call low data value density. So boring data. You don't want to store huge amounts of boring data in the system. But if it's kind of high value, high density data, like imagine text of the Constitution or images from Ukraine or something like this, then you will want to use this system. But anyone that is willing to pay the price is able to write into this network. And we can do this because we have this different business model than a traditional archive, where you're taking sort of donations of materials, and then the archive is taking on the responsibility of paying for its storage. Well, because we have the storage endowment, anyone that is willing to pay to have this data stored for a long enough period of time is able to do so, which is an interesting democratization, I think. So this obviously has an important second component, which is that it's fully auditable. So for every piece of data written to the network, you get a large amount of metadata about that interaction. We call it a transaction, but you can think of it as an interaction with the system. So here is what we call a block explorer. It's a way of finding our way around the blockchain, essentially. And this transaction here, it's got this funny identifier. That's the hash I was referring to. At the top, we see that it is by this address, TH825I, whatever, that's someone from the network. We can see the date, the moment at which it was written to the network. And that is a verifiable tamper-resistant timestamp in the way that I was referring to before. The longer time goes by, the harder it becomes to edit that timestamp. You can see the size, and then some metadata about it. So the user here has added some content types. So they're saying, hey, this thing that I'm uploading is a piece of plain text, and a bunch of other data. What's interesting is that we can see not just one interaction, but all of the interactions from this user. And so when we're thinking about archival integrity, we can say, okay, well, it's not just about what the data was uploaded, because of course that can be done permissionlessly. So anyone can upload a piece of data. Well, how do we know it's legitimate? Well, in the same way that you browse the web, and you might trust New or nytimes.com or washingtonpost.com, but you won't necessarily trust some sketchy link some friend sends you to a supposed news site spouting nonsense, right? And it's the same kind of thing. So you might gain a reputation around this address, and it's associated with an identity that you may or may not trust. And so it's a big open archive that anyone can write to, but you have the tools required to see if you should trust those pieces of archive data built into the system itself. Archive's been going for, in 2 weeks' time, it'll be 4 years. Now it's been growing. There's a bit of a funny graph, because if you look, if we were to rewind a year ago, it essentially looks the same. But if you look a year ago now, it looks like there was almost no usage. But it's been growing at an exponential rate over that period of time. It's not a huge amount of data still. It's about 70 terabytes. But interestingly, that data is split across somewhere over, I think it's 300 million individual artifacts. So the things that people are willing to pay to store on Arweave tend to be kind of smaller, just because the storage is not cheap. It's not like Amazon S3, where you go and you pay like a tiny fraction of a cent to store a terabyte for a month or something. Well, we have this endowment model, which is really built with conservative estimates built in. So you have to, paying for 200 years worth of storage at the present prices is not like as cheap as a temporary storage system. But so we tend to look at the number of assets inside this thing, and it's about 300 million now, which is a good start. The data is replicated pretty well across the globe at this point. So there's a big concentration of nodes in China, some other places in Asia, Thailand, some nodes in Australia, some nodes in South America, Brazil, Venezuela. United States is obviously a big concentration, Canada, and then France, Germany, and a few other places in Europe. Unfortunately, there is almost no representation in Africa at the moment, but there is some small amount of representation in the Middle East. Most recently, our community has been archiving data out of Ukraine, where they've essentially harvested 69 million, or probably that was taken yesterday, so probably around 70 million now, documents from the conflict there, which are all replicated in these hundreds of places across the world. I think one of the interesting components of this is that because it's a permissionless archive, and anyone can add data from anywhere in the world, then you sort of get this effect of, I saw it described quite elegantly by someone at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war as the, quote, TikTok war. What they meant was that if you think back to arguably the last theater conflict of this size in Iraq in 2003, you essentially had two sources of information, more or less, at least contemporaneously. You had the US side and the Iraqi side, and the governments were speaking, and you kind of had to work out who to believe more or less from that. And then you had journalists who were embedded with the US government's permission with their forces, but of course that gave away some level of integrity of the reporting, I would argue. Whereas now there's third-party observers to the war that are able to upload that information to the web or to social media, and also now to Arweave. And so you can get a more neutral, or at least you say non-geopolitically aligned view of the conflict. And I think that when we're looking back on this archive decades or hundreds of years from now, that ability to sort of see through a third-party lens will be quite powerful. A lot of these pieces of information are reports of locations of Russian tanks before the war broke out, for example, and movements of armies. And I look back at the history textbooks and so on. We saw when I was growing up, looking at World War II, and we saw, well, X country invaded Y country, and there's not a huge amount of detail. Well, this archive is extraordinarily detailed. It has reports of moments of tank battalions moving through certain towns and so on that are pinpointable. You can reconstruct an extremely high fidelity view of what is happening in the world from this data, which we think is pretty interesting. I hope will be valuable long term. And of course, all this information spread in hundreds or probably actually thousands of places across the world. So it's impossible to remove or censor, and it's distributed well enough that I hope it would survive a nuclear war. It's really distributed in so many places, it would be hard to believe that the last copies of it would be wiped out. Next thing that we're experimenting with in the Arweave community is incentivized archiving. So I haven't actually mentioned NFTs up until this point, but we learned from this community effort around Ukraine that there are lots of people that are interested in archiving, but to some extent someone has to pay for it and be motivated to take part in doing it. And we're very interested in seeing, we're working with a couple of national libraries around the world that are interested in this. But can we have people essentially subsidize the storage of information into the network if that stored data is issued to them in some form of, we like to call them artifacts. I don't think that an NFT is the right phrasing for this, where they are the guardian of that data. And then whether that data is transferable or not, so whether they can give their guardianship to someone else is a setting you can turn on and off. But we think that this could be a way, and there are a couple of interested parties in experimenting with this with us. It could be an interesting way to incentivize people to pay for the storage of valuable data inside the system that replicates it around the world. So if you're interested in that, please do reach out to me. I would love to chat to you. All right, thank you so much for your attention. I hope it was interesting.
Thanks so much, Sam. Yeah, that was very enlightening, and I think we'll have a lot of questions during the Q&A. Thank you again for your presentation. So our next speaker, Francis Lytle, is a researcher, writer, and advisor working at the intersection of cultural institutions, arts, and Web3, working in partnership with the National Museums, Liverpool, and the University of Manchester. Her PhD research explored the application of blockchain, specifically non-fungible tokens, NFTs, which we've mentioned quite a bit so far, in museum audience engagement practices, and considered how this technology supports and or disrupts concepts such as digital ownership, guardianship, authority, authenticity, and value. Obviously, this project has inspired actually many a conversation in this museum as well as other museums around the world. Frances utilizes her knowledge from this work to provide support and guidance to cultural organizations exploring NFTs and Web3 through a values-led approach. Her current interests focus on exploring the themes of Web3 to critically unpack questions around decolonization, reciprocation, and intellectual property. She has previously written for peer-reviewed publications such as Museum and Society and media such as Flash Art, Art Quarterly, Art Gnome, and Cultural Practices. Frances, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so hopefully the slides, I'm not in control of my slides, so hopefully this should all work fine. Hello everyone, yeah, my name is Frances. Yeah, so as I said, I'm a researcher, writer, and advisor, and I just finished my PhD, and my thesis actually got published this on Monday, so it's now freely available, and I've actually got a QR code at the end just to for you to kind of download if you're interested. But yeah, so the talk that I'm kind of focused on today is really just to give you a little bit of an overview about what my research was, what I did, and really thinking more about, again, this idea of embedding different voices and narratives into museum collections, and thinking much more about this idea of democratizing the collection, which is a term that gets thrown around so much within museums. Non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, which are types of tokens stored on a blockchain that allows us to kind of have certificates of ownership or authenticity of digital work. So we were thinking, how do we use these tokens within audience and community engagement practices, which could then inform ideas around social value? But I was also interested on a theoretical level, and what my thesis really is looking at this theoretical underpinnings of what does blockchain do about this idea of ownership, authority, and authenticity, and how does blockchain or this technology, or indeed the spirit of Web3, help to extend our knowledge or understanding about these ideas within museum theory. So I was very much looking from a museum perspective and thinking about how do we kind of disrupt our current thinking about these ideas. And yeah, today I'm really thinking about this idea of authority, but just to kind of say there are many other areas within the thesis kind of covers as well. So if you could be bothered to read 200 pages, I would recommend. But yeah, so if you do next slide, please. So to first of all kind of give you perhaps a little bit more background on the kind of terms that I'm thinking about. So as I said, on a practical level, we were kind of thinking about how do we use this to within museum or audience engagement practices, and within that was thinking about this idea of social value, which is a term which is used within cultural policy and impact studies to kind of think about how do museums create value that is not necessarily monetary in nature. And of course, within research, we see this come under the term of cultural value. So particularly David Thoresby argues that cultural value symbolizes the positive characteristics of culture, such as the artistic value of an artwork, its historical worth, as well in the broader context. And it also includes things like historical value, symbolic value, aesthetic value, authenticity value, and spiritual value. So social value is actually just one of the many branches of this idea of cultural value. And more specifically, how I understand social value really derives from three main theorists. So in the first sense, there's John Holden's idea, who notes social value as reinforcing a sense of unity and identity by making connections between different people. Meanwhile, Carol Scott says how social value is part of a museum's intrinsic value for communities, which is experienced through a museum's contribution to sense of place, community identity, and the use of civic spaces. And then lastly, but not least, is Nina Simon's famous work, particularly within kind of UK and US literature, and her work on the kind of participatory museum. And there she states that social value is a way of making visitors feel more connected to the institution and more confident of their ability to contribute in collaborative projects with museums. So what my project was really thinking about was, how does the NFT, how can we use this technology to create connections between our participants and the NML, which might inform this sense of kind of identity, this idea of connection, community identity, or indeed this kind of sense of belonging as well. Next slide, please. So on the other hand, my work also contributes to questions around the part of return, and this kind of is speaking to the more theoretical aspects that I was looking at. And the part of return is really an idea, again, that has been spoken a lot, particularly in kind of UK museums in the last few decades. Again, as I just mentioned, Nina Simon's work of the part museum is kind of a big indicator of this. But it's also informed by theories such as the new museology, Hooper Greenhill's the Post Museum, and things like the Relevant Museum as well. And in each of these cases, what it's really trying to argue is we need to move away from an object-centered approach to one that is more people-centered. So in other words, this is kind of informed by like post-structuralist thinking and the kind of focus where it's not really about what the object is, but actually how the reader or the viewer understands that work. In this way, it kind of shifts away from what we might see as the Enlightenment thinking about truth with a capital T as being kind of singular, and instead think about how do we embed different ways of reading and understanding objects into the collections, which then actually relies on the network of people surrounding a particular object as well. So in practice, what this really kind of looks like is a lot of collaborations with audiences, with surrounding communities, through things such as storytelling or co-producing exhibitions are kind of very popular approaches. And to kind of highlight one example, Object Stories at the Portland Museum is quite a good case in point. So this was an online platform which initially launched in 2010 to promote a digital space for dialogue and the exchanging of ideas. So the initial project included a physical exhibition where visitors and communities could basically share their stories about personal objects, which the initial exhibition basically reflects that idea of the participatory museum, because again, the process of interpretation and exhibition creation is being shared with the museum visitor. Likewise, visitors to Object Stories could actually then interact with other people's stories as well, whilst also producing their own display and then have these displayed in the exhibit. So basically, this informs this idea of shared authority. And this project still exists online, as I said, on this platform, where people can continually be encouraged to share their stories about personal objects, which then also can then turn into kind of thematic exhibitions in the platform as well. So what it does is essentially continually promote a conversation and highlight individuals' stories and objects. So this is all kind of a really nice idea, but at the same time, there is continually a bit of a risk in all of this. The risk that we assume that by bringing people into the conversation, we are automatically in some way creating democracy. And this is something that particularly happens a lot with the digital. There is a completely kind of misassumption that the digital automatically creates this democratic space, and therefore everything is accessible and everything's fine and we can just kind of leave it there. But actually, this is certainly by far not at all the case at all. And particularly if you're thinking about in literature, I found within kind of discussions around digital repatriation projects, for example, or digital returns, where museums work with source communities to create digital replicas or use the digital as a kind of means for conversations about cultural works. This research kind of highlights how often the digital is seen as that democratic space, but this then disregards the deeply political and power structures that are continually evident even when the digital is in place. So what this leads to is that many scholars argue that projects such as this aren't really kind of repatriation at all. It's more like digital reciprocation, or perhaps just an interim step into that process of repatriation. In other words, it is difficult to truly create something in the digital that is fully collaborative, but also that doesn't live without any power dynamics. Unfortunately, when it comes to museums, and I'm talking as well, speaking to a lot of kind of UK museums with its colonial history, there comes as well some very complex power structures that don't just disappear overnight. And these are kind of similar problems that I found continually with my own work with NML, which are problems that I'll later come back to at the end of this talk as well. So next slide, please. Oh yes, next slide, please. Move to the next slide, please. Okay, thanks. So what we did in terms of the actual project was, so we worked with a group of participants over the course of 2 workshops back in at the start of 2020 and the summer of 2020, where we basically co-produced an online exhibition called Crypto Connections, which explores the personal relationship to objects. And if you go onto, or even if you just search Crypto Connections, National Museums of Liverpool, hopefully it should come up for you. And basically what is formed there are 2 types of objects. We have personal objects and we have museum objects as well. And each of them were chosen by our participants. We then asked the participants to basically write up a story about their kind of personal relationship to that object. So why did they choose it? What's personal to them, and so on. And if you go into the exhibition, you'll see each object is displayed with their personal experience connected to it, rather than it being like the typical kind of curatorial metadata. We then basically developed NFTs of each object and gave these out to the participants. And we did this using a temporary digital space that we developed, which we call the Possession Gallery. And that is connected to a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain. So that basically allowed me to mint and create these tokens and then hand these out. And then the Possession Gallery was like a temporary space where we could represent all these different objects together. Because of course, as soon as you hand one of the identities out, it then is owned by the participant rather than the museum. So that was kind of the very kind of basic idea. So it's really, and as you can see on the right, there are just 2 examples of the tokens. So again, it's really, really simple. We just took kind of it, and all this information is actually deriving from the online exhibition as well. It's also perhaps important to point out that the original plan with this and our participants all identified as LGBT+. So our original idea had been actually to use specifically LGBT+ objects. And that was because NML has done a lot of work with this marginalized community. And I say marginalized in the sense that the LGBT voice is not often represented in collections particularly. So we were thinking, how do we do this with NFTs? But unfortunately, because during the first workshop, I think, again, because of the personal nature of it, it was interesting to find that a lot of the participants just didn't want these objects or their personal experiences about that aspect of their life to be represented. So we had to kind of acknowledge that and in the end, we just chose general objects in the collection instead, which is still kind of represents the main argument, which is this idea that NFTs exploring kind of a different point of view, but it's unfortunate that we couldn't kind of really focus on that idea of the marginalized communities. But this was kind of something that, of course, I also did kind of interviews with colleagues at the NML, and it's interesting that many of them also kind of recognize this idea of it representing different narratives. So if you go to the next slide, please. So Parson A was actually one of my colleagues from the NML who took part in the workshops, and it's interesting that they said in workshop 2 in July, saying you only normally get 3 sentences on the text panel, and it largely just explains what the thing is. But what I like about this is that it gives you an added layer of history to something, as it were, and an interpretation that you don't get in the gallery space. And that for me is the most important part of it. It is the reception and the interpretation. And if you go to the next slide. again, it was something, again, noted within these interviews that I did, is that, again, this was the thing that they really picked up on and really thing that they really liked and felt that it very much represented what NML was doing in other areas of its work. So Participant 4 noted how I would hope that people would get involved and give a perspective that most people wouldn't usually get when they walk around the museum, because they're just looking at the facts and what the curator has offered them. So again, it's this idea that actually it's not the curator, and of course that's not to disregard the expertise of the curator at all in this way, but what this is doing is prompting us to think about the objects in a slightly different way. And again, this is something that Participant 2 kind of noted, how saying, I like the idea of exploring the emotions around objects and a human connection to it, because I think this is what makes it interesting for a lot of people. And again, we are really fascinated by the emotional or personal connection. You know, we're always interested in oral histories rather than necessarily the facts themselves. And what this does is kind of highlight that different perspective. So if you go to the next slide, please. And then it was interesting as well, then thinking about the participants and how they felt about their NFTs, because of course, at the end of the day, Crypto Connections as an online exhibition kind of achieves what we set out to do. So then it's thinking, well, why do we have the NFT in the first place? And Parson G noted how they thought of the NFT as a kind of collectible, and thinking also how eventually, if all the museum objects were made into collectibles and people started collecting them, they would have this particular one. So in the way they're highlighting that actually this project makes something that is completely unique and identifiable, and it's something that they personally own, which they kind of have started to see as valuable. And if you go to the next slide, please. And the same with Parson D, who noted quite often when I've been to museums or galleries, you know, I might buy a postcard or something I like, and at the end of the day, that postcard probably just sits in a drawer or something anyway. So kind of, you know, it's a more sustainable way of having that memory. Now, of course, this idea of sustainability is kind of funny because, of course, we used Ethereum, which is actually a proof of work blockchain, which is quite energy intensive. But what they were talking about in this idea of sustainability is that, you know, of course, we can sometimes collect loads of physical things and put them together, and it becomes, you know, something that kind of takes up a lot of our physical space. But NFTs, yes, they still take up space because digital still has a materiality, but it's not sense of this is like a space that is confronting us per se. And they really like that idea. And particularly as, you know, all of the NFTs are stored on their phone, they have a way to constantly refer to that memory and go back to it as well. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this is all kind of well and good, and it's all very nice again, as I said, like, oh, look, they own these NFTs that have their own personal experiences. But this kind of raises the question of, well, what does it really mean to own an NFT at all? And this kind of requires us to return to what kind of we understand as the idea of ownership. And to kind of highlight just a quick definition of formal ownership, we might define that under the bundle of rights. So these are things like the right to hold, the right to possess, the right to exclude, to loan, exchange, and so on. And with NFTs, and particularly with these participants, I talk about them having decentralized ownership because technically they completely own their NFT and what it represents, and the museum can't take that away from them. And certainly they can exchange that token as well, and they can possess it and, you know, control it in some ways. Of course, they can't actually exclude others from it necessarily because of the limitations of the technology. But in digging a little bit deeper into this, what I started to realize one of my conversations with some of the participants was actually the ability to exchange was actually being compromised by the association with the NML. So actually what was happening here was, because particularly for the museum objects, it represents an object that the NML owns, but the NFT is completely owned by the participant. And it creates this kind of layered effect of ownership, where, of course, this has the potential to be quite positive. And I talk about it on one end, you could create this idea of shared guardianship, where, you know, they own the digital version, the museum owns the physical version. Let's make this a kind of partnership or relationship where the NFT represents a sense of guardianship over that image. But on the other end, it also highlights actually just this issue of a power dynamic at play, one that is very familiar when we're talking about collaborations in museums. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this is something that Participant 4 noted from the museum interviews. He said, in terms of the museum, it's not actually losing anything it needs in order to carry out its aims, whether that's to educate, to research, or for its visitors. So in other words, what is the museum actually giving away when it gives these NFTs? Next slide, please. So what this creates is what could be described as a keeping while giving paradox, which is a term that derives from both Annette Winner's famous work in 1992 on gift-giving oceanic societies, but also Heidi Geimer's famous work within kind of the context of digital returns, where the museum basically has a tendency to retain control over the rights, such as copyright, and indeed the physical work as in terms a kind of sense of guardianship over the work. But in fact, this simply creates an ownership dynamic that is merely symbolic in nature. So in other words, the transformation ownership in this case through the NFT becomes a symbolic gesture and indeed runs the risk of being a form of tokenism, which is a term I derive from Sherry Arnston's work on system participation. So she describes this ladder as being made up of 8 rungs, and this together kind of has 3 overarching themes. On the one end is non-participation, then there's tokenism and system power. So, and each theme also then correlates to 2 to 3 rungs on a ladder and denote this kind of hierarchy of participation. So system power represents an equally shared authority, whilst non-participation represents quite the opposite. Tokenism then relates to this point of in between, and it's where basically participants do not have equal agency with the facilitator, but holds some control over the project and decision making. So in other words, the participants have a voice in the project, but they lack the power to ensure that their views are being heeded. And likewise, the participants in this project have a representation of their ownership in the form of the token, but that token really offers them little else apart from just a symbolic gesture of a connection. In turn, this leaves us with a situation of kind of sharing over shared control. And again, I use these different tenses in a purposeful way, drawing from Michael Fisher's work, who identifies these different tenses as a way to delineate control. Specifically, the present tense is used to identify a weighted decision-making, whereas shared infers something that is actually inherently neutral. So what we see here is actually these power dynamics that are so prevalent in museums is still being played out even when we're talking about technologies that are deemed to be democratizing or decentralized. Next slide, please. So that was kind of, we're thinking about a theoretical idea. That is kind of some of the conclusions I make, but this doesn't really leave us much in terms of like the practical elements of where do we go from here. And whilst these aren't kind of necessarily concrete kind of helpful kind of points, hopefully they help kind of build on where to go from here, basically. So firstly, we can't assume that technology will enforce democracy. This is, of course, something that is ultimately a people problem, not a technology problem. Nor can the technology disregard the deeply political and historical context of the institution. And indeed, we should not be ignoring the fact that the technology has its own deeply contentious historical context. Let's think about libertarianism and where, the concepts of Bitcoin. Of course, though, this is not to say that NFTs don't offer something. And of course, they are an extension to what museums are already doing about experimenting with the digital and playing around with different ways of displaying and presenting and understanding works. And of course, there is this exciting opportunity with NFTs that it offers this idea of exchange. And of course, we talk about exchange the whole time in the idea of the financial exchange of NFTs. But actually, we could also think about this as a digital dialogue or conversation. And something that I talk about in my thesis is this idea of the NFT being a way of adding layers of interpretation. So each time you exchange the NFT, you could then also embed your own personal experience into it. And of course, in practice, that might be quite difficult in terms of actually the amount of data that would collect. But what would this be happening would be the idea of exchange being a form of social value rather than monetary value. But last but not least, ultimately, this all comes down to the concept of use value. And of course, as I said, with my project, there was very much this issue of it being a kind of ownership or gesture idea. But actually, if there was a sort of governance aspect to it, a membership access to it, having some form of utility could actually help to counteract that problem of tokenism. Again, not in every case, but it's certainly something that perhaps is something to think about, particularly if museums are thinking about how do we engage communities with NFTs. So next slide, please. So thank you very much. And yeah, as I said at the start, that is a QR code to access my thesis if you would like to read it. And of course, please feel free to contact me on Twitter or by email.
Some of us in the museum sector have been reading about crypto connections quite a bit, so it's quite the privilege to actually hear about it directly from you. And to be able to ask questions. So that being said, we've received a lot of questions online, actually. But before we move on to sort of these public questions that have come in, I wanted to ask both of you a number of questions related to your presentation. And for the audience here, maybe to give some context of how, why we would invite Sam and Francis on the same panel is, if we think about what are really the stakes sometimes within the museum that is a custodian of a public or national collection, on the one hand, it plays an important role as a repository, as an archive, and the absence of or the building of these public collections are particularly important within Southeast Asia, where the study of Southeast Asian contemporary art or art is sort of nascent, and these are things that, and having archives and having libraries and resources are things that are very important within our different societies. The other hand, museums also think about what the social impact or the social value of history and artifacts have for society, and we're constantly jostling and considering what that means in relation to the way that we engage with display. So if anyone in the audience is wondering why we would bring such different perspectives together, part of it is both Sam and Francis speak to different aspects that are at the core of a museum that has a public or national collection. So obviously this relates back to the National Gallery Singapore. So with that said, thank you both again for your presentations, and I think that I want to pick up on something that is a resonance between both your presentations, and Sam, if you don't mind, if we could go back to your presentation, could you tell us a little bit more about the artifact, which you were saying the NFT is not the adequate word. How does the artifact work, and how are you using this as a form of incentivized archiving?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. And I think Francis just totally covered this pretty well. Like the idea of ownership for NFTs is ill-defined at best. I actually think the word ownership is just wrong. It's just flatly incorrect. For most NFT types. There are some NFTs that unlock access to things, and those might be seen as closer to a physical world bundle of rights. But for almost every NFT, particularly ones that are actually, so the data is stored on Arweave, you really don't get any other right other than the ability to exchange it. And in this case, we're looking at some of these artifacts as what Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, would call soul-bound NFTs. So non-transferable types. You can simply display in your wallet in some form and essentially create a kind of personal museum or archive one way or another. So a display case of the interesting artifacts that you've collected. Yes, we're interested in this model that essentially says, okay, a gallery or an archive, or even just someone thinking that they can scrape some interesting information from the web, can come along and publish a specification of a pool that they would like to run. And anyone can come along and then contribute to this pool. And in doing so, they put essentially funds available for the storage of data. And then they minted some of these, so given some of these artifacts as a result of that, proportionate to their contribution for the archive. And this is pretty interesting because it's likely to lead to a situation where there is an excess of funds available for the storage of data, and that can be taken as a donation to the archive itself. And so you can create an upside, if you will, not just the preservation of the digital replicas of the data found in the archive or in the gallery or museum or whatever it happens to be, library maybe. Yes, but also you end up getting a donation at the end of it. We're really just experimenting with this at the moment, but I think it could be an interesting area. But to the broader question around NFT ownership, I think that it's really just a case of branding. Particularly if the data is on Arweave, then nobody has would you say privileged control of it in any form. It's available to all people for all time without gates. And so it's really hard to say that looks, if you kind of own a representation of that asset, it's really hard to describe that as anything close to a physical ownership of assets in the real world. So I think a closer analogy is sponsorship. You are the person that sponsors the asset because you're the person that essentially created the incentive for the person to create the work or to record the work. But in the case of archival data, we think that guardian might be a better phrase. You're the person that is responsible for, protecting the data.
Sam, thanks for that answer, because there's parallels, are obviously, Francis, to what you were speaking about in relation to a sense of shared guardianship. And we actually had a bunch of questions related to this in the YouTube chat, but could you maybe go a little bit more into that when we're talking about shared guardianship? Because some people have asked, wouldn't there be IP rights issued when we create NFTs based on the museum exhibits? Is the sense of guardianship really a much more emotional tie, or is there more that you notice come out of your project, or how you're articulating your PhD?
Yeah, so I think a point I should highlight is I come from the research I was doing was very much looking at what comes from consumer research, actually, is this idea of psychological ownership. And it's a really intriguing idea because it is exactly that idea, the emotional link. But of course, looking at it from a much more psychological or social science aspect of it. We might also call that kind of cultural ownership or historical ownership within museum theory, the deep connection that we might have to objects because of the extension of our identity in that work or the representation of our culture, our society, or so on. So that's what we were looking at. And to the point about IP, I think, again, there's this kind of misassumption that NFTs equal IP or equal some form of rights. That actually, it's very hard to actually embed rights into an NFT. You embed them into the terms and conditions on the side. Hence, that is just like a whole other issue in itself. And then again, this is kind of coming back to this issue, then what is NFT ownership? And actually, a lot of it, as I said, is this kind of gesture. But to Sam's point, and again, I dedicate kind of almost a whole chapter to the idea of guardianship, because I really like that idea, because it speaks so much to what museums have already been doing within their work and collaborations. They're recognizing their role as not just a custodian, but a guardian, which is the dynamic form of ownership. It's a relationship, not like, here you go, here's the object, let's leave it there. It's about, okay, where do we go from here? Let's bring exchanges in. It's a continuous hard work kind of relationship. And yeah, that's why I like the idea of guardianship. And actually I was just talking yesterday in a group as well, talking about how let's just stop talking about ownership in the NFT space and bring in these different ideas. I like the idea of sponsorship as well, again, because all it is identifying yourself and saying, yeah, I'm associated with that. I relate to that. And I think a lot of museum work is also about that as well. It's unpacking those emotional ties.
Have you found it harder with heightened sort of speculation around NFTs? I mean, it's uneven around the world, but in Singapore, maybe because Metacoven's based here, we had considerable hype around it. And we've had our own sort of independent NFT shows and all this sort of thing. And we have a couple of funds here. And, the discourse in Singapore around NFTs is very much leaning into the speculative side of things. And I'm wondering, you did this project over the last, I think, 3 years, and it was before sort of the boom. Have you found that it's harder to seed these much more nuanced ideas of moving away from ownership because of this weird speculative market that's just kind of burst into the scene.
Yeah, completely. I found myself in a bit of a strange situation because, of course, there's a lot of museums kind of coming to me asking for advice, but essentially they're asking for advice about how to fundraise, which is not really what my whole concept is. I mean, of course, like that is great, and I really love that idea of museum like NFTs being that alternative, or Web3 just generally offering that alternative fundraising mechanism. But as you say, like my work is so much more than that. It's so much more about the values or other values that, you know, tokenization creates. And it was kind of strange in 2021, all this talk about all these other projects taking place. And I think people have kind of understood my projects, but again, it's because it's like, well, there's no like money being made, or perhaps there was no price tag. It didn't necessarily pick up as much interest, I found, as some of the other projects did, because of, I think, perhaps the nature of it, and I suppose because it was probably so experimental in its approach, that perhaps people were just I mean, people are confused by NFTs anyway, so they're probably quite confused about what my kind of ultimate aim was. But yeah, completely, it was it's been a very strange 3 years for sure.
You're actually getting to something really interesting, which I think, Sam, if you don't mind, I'm going to pivot to you, and then I'm going to take public questions before, so that we have enough time to go through all of these questions. But, you know, this whole question about moving away from ownership and the way that both of you have talked about your projects respectively, and Sam used the word sponsorship, but what we're almost looking at is a whole different kind of, if you don't mind me saying, relationship to what it means to share something publicly. You know, Sam, in the case of Arweave, what you're really doing is building this completely public archive where it's decentralized in the sense that sometimes we think about public goods, they're sustained by states, they're sustained by certain kinds of social contracts, whatever, but you've sort of put this you've systemized this in a way, right, across different nodes, and sure, there's a sponsorship system in which it keeps the system running, but you're not giving ownership to one person. So it's almost like our relationship to public ownership is fundamentally questioned by this. And Francis, obviously this is coming out of your work, and you've so kind of articulated the complexities of that when it comes to museum collections, right? Because museum collections are owned by publics in many different shapes and forms, how they're engaged with, how they're put together, you know, the funds that go into making acquisitions. I mean, it's different all around the world, but still we all arrive back at this idea of what is a public, right? And what does it mean to be connected to a public or to share ownership publicly, whatever that means, right? It's very amorphous what I'm talking about. But with that in mind, Sam, can you talk a little bit about the communities that are forming? And are you seeing, you know, like how is this sort of challenge to ownership, like real ownership of assets, and this sort of much more public consciousness coming out through Arweave? Big question.
I think this is super interesting. Arweave, to some extent, comes from the old hacker idea that information wants to be free, basically. That really, as soon as we created the internet, which allows us to move data at the speed of light for virtually zero cost. We created a system of almost information abundance. And Arweave takes the next step of that and says, okay, well, if we have information abundance today, let's make sure that that information is also around tomorrow too, which is actually the precise opposite of the scarcity market that is created by NFTs. So there's a great kind of dichotomy here, which we've been exploring, and I think is, you know, some of the trends we see in the NFT space are actually very disappointing in some form. The idea of people attempting to use the recreation of scarcity in cyberspace, where really it's unnecessary. You can move information to every computer virtually for free, pretty close to free. The recreation of scarcity of access to information is a sad thing, I think. So we see a lot of NFT projects that are adding these sort of gates, if you will, where you can't access a piece of content unless you own the NFT. That's pretty disappointing. But on the flip side of that, we see a more encouraging trend, which is that, so they're still using the word ownership, but really what's happening is the data is completely ownerless. As if it's on Arweave, anyone can access it. And the people that are trying to make it gated, they put ciphertext on Arweave, so the encrypted version. But if it's not encrypted, anyone can get access to it, and it's replicated across the world, for all people to access for all time. Like, it's a pretty open, it's as open as you can get, I would say. But I think that this question of ownership in cyberspace is only going to become more important as we kind of descend into cyberspace as people. Like, nowadays we spend, I would say probably more than 50% of our time living in cyberspace. We probably crossed that barrier over the pandemic, something like that. And if you look at the technologies that are on the horizon, like VR and then BCI, you see that the trend will only get more extreme. I think we will be more or less living in digital worlds, not 50 years from now. So there's this great opportunity that means that the scarcity of the physical world can be circumvented. That's really super exciting. But if we add, scarcity for no reason back into that system, that would be paradise lost in some sense. But that all being said, there is an interesting game you can play here, which is that if you call something ownership, which the NFT people do, and then you allow people to have that representation of ownership, but not really give them any power or control over the asset, then they are essentially sponsoring the creation of works with their money, which I think is a good thing. So you get people to, last year we saw a lot of this. People built cool stuff and they made great art, which they made publicly available for all people to access for all time for free. But then somebody somewhere paid to have their name attached to it. And that was kind of enough to pay the artists for their work, which is weird, but it worked. So I guess I see that side as positive, but there are also some dangers.
Thanks so much, Sam. Okay, we are down to like the last sort of 15 minutes that we have. So I'm going to jump to questions from the audience because we have quite a few, though I would love to continue this discussion we're kind of getting to. So I'll start with technical questions if you don't mind. So this comes from Andre. Slightly more technical question for Sam. How did you determine the metadata schema for archive records stored on the permaweb so as to make records accessible in and to the future?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So we were inspired by this sort of clash of ideas created by Gopher and HTTP back in 1991 and 1992, I think. But basically, Gopher was this pre-web protocol that had the same sort of ideas. It was a connected knowledge base, but it didn't have hyperlinks between parts of the ideas, if you will, parts of the knowledge and other pieces of knowledge. It was at the level of the page. So you'd have citations. Your page would link to other pages. It wasn't like the words could link to other pages. But one of the ideas that Gopher had, which was better than the original web, I think, was rich metadata, which they sort of grabbed from the librarians at the university they were working at when they were building this protocol. And we saw the same thing. We saw, well, actually, the web, you want as much metadata as you possibly can. And so we thought, well, okay, there's some stuff that we can provide at the blockchain level. So when was the data written into the chain? That's pretty obvious. We can provide a tamper-resistant record of that. When was the data signed by a key? So this is just another way of sort of narrowing that down even further. You can say the person with access to this special encryption key signed it within 20 minutes of this moment in time, which is kind of interesting for a number of technical reasons. But other stuff like who it was, so the digital signature, the addresses associated with the data. But then there's other things. So we opened up the tag schema to be basically like limitless. You can add key values and also just key tags to any piece of data. And then we index on these and we make them available via what is essentially a sort of database querying engine, actually built by Facebook. It was GraphQL, which is fairly standardized. But that means that you can build applications on top of this open data set, which is pretty interesting. Like someone showed me a demo of something yesterday that searches the whole permaweb in this really rich way for things or images that have cats and then images that have cats and dogs. And so it's kind of like a tagged web in some sense that you can query in one place. I think what that will mean is something we'll find out like 50 years from now, but I think it should be pretty interesting.
Thanks, Sam. We have one more technical question, which I'm going to add on here because it's kind of related, and it comes from, I think, people who know each other. Why do people usually store their NFT metadata in IPFS, which is the interplanetary file system, instead of Arweave? It's a little bit of a naughty one, but...
That's okay. Well, I don't think that they necessarily do anymore. So in the Ethereum world, that tends to be the case. Ethereum predates Arweave by a few years, and IPFS was around when they got started. And it's essentially a hash-based system. I think our main gripe with our IPFS, well, I mean, it's not permanent, it's part of the problem, but the key issue, I think, is that it uses content IDs rather than transaction IDs. So it really just takes the piece of data itself and says the identifier is related to the piece of data. But we're inspired by the archivists, and we see that, well, that's not really the point. It's the piece of data put in the archive by a person at a point in time with a set of associated tags. That's how you want to address things, so that you can kind of be, clear about what things are. But in the Solana ecosystem, these types of things, Arweave stores 95% of the NFTs. So, yeah.
Thank you for answering those technical questions. And we'll get to some bigger questions later on geopolitics. But before we go there, and about the environment, Francis, if you don't mind, I'll go back to you because there are a couple. We're going to do a little bit of racing through these questions so that our audience can have their answers sort of satisfied. So this is actually from a fellow curator, and they're really interested in your project, and they're interested in sort of how the participants respond. What participants respond? Did all of your participants think of their responses as valuable? Add on to that, and one of the things she asks is why she's trying to understand why a participant would need an NFT to feel secure about their ownership of their narrative, or is the project more a kind of problematizing of the experience of ownership and control? So it's kind of like a 3-part one question. I'm so sorry, Francis. If you need me to repeat, let me know.
Yeah, I think I've got them all. Yeah, so I should say that, definitely not all the participants saw the NFT as valuable. And I should probably also mention that all the participants didn't know anything about blockchain when we started. And we were trying to explain to them, back in 2020 when, blockchain wasn't cool. And so we had to spend a good morning trying to explain just what's made up of it. So that also, I think, made a big impact on whether they actually then see the token as valuable, because not only it requires you this kind of level of knowledge, but also the level of knowledge to then feel confident enough to access it and then feel like you could exchange it if you wanted to. And I felt like some of them did, but I'm not sure. And I think one of the things was we came up against this kind of classic, well, I can right click and save it kind of argument, which is perfectly valid. And, it's that thing of, it's just dependent on what your value systems are. And if you don't see this idea of scarcity or identification as a valuable asset in the digital space, then of course it was rendered meaningless. And that's actually kind of basically the conclusion of my thesis, is that despite the fact that the museum adds this kind of authoritative or authenticated nature to the NFT, and despite the fact blockchain adds this kind of authenticateness and artificial value, it's still very much down on the person and what they view their NFT to be. And that's why I've started thinking more and realizing more, I'm seeing that more with NFT kind of market reports as well, is that NFTs are incredibly personal things. There are, of course, people doing it for speculativeness, but of course, actually deep down, a lot of people do it because for very personal reasons, whether that's to support the artist or so on and so forth. The other point as well was, I suppose, ultimately, my project really was very much coming from a researcher. So, it was to look how to use this experiment to extend our understanding. And that's what my thesis attempts to achieve. So, it's not necessarily you know, it's not a way to kind of validate someone's sense of ownership of their narrative. Of course, it does that. And again, it kind of goes back to that question of use value. If actually on a practical level, really what this needs is some form of utility, whatever that may be, is completely contingent on the people you're working with. If it's more broader audience, that could be membership ideas. If it's with a particular sort of community, then maybe it's like the physical objects returned and the NFT is a way to, recognize that process. So yeah, in terms of my project, it was very much thinking about how do we play around with the ideas of kind of ownership and authority and authenticity as well.
Thank you so much. You know, it's really nice to actually be able to speak to both of you and to hear both your perspectives. And you know, we keep going back to ownership, and I know that part of that is kind of guided by how both your presentations have resonated with each other. But it's almost, in a sense, we're liberating some of these artifacts, archives, from this very not so much centralized, but we're liberating them from the perception of them. You know, where public ownership is one that is kept within institutions. And it's quite interesting because some of this is obviously quite utopic in its dreaming, right? If we take this thought to its natural conclusion, that maybe our sense of ownership, our sense of communities will be completely different. And this is something that comes out in one of the questions we have here. Which is the crypto blockchain world inherently utopian, in the sense that they can't really see the risk involved? I see your eyes, Sam. I saw that. It is something actually that we deal with a lot within Singapore as a scene that is very much leaning into Web3 and fintech, and it's a question that we come up at. Francis, I have a pivot for you on this question, but if you don't mind, I'll direct this at Sam first. And this is where I was hoping you could maybe speak a bit about your nodes that are all around the world and some of the geopolitics that have informed Arweave, because you know, you talked about the Ukraine conflict, but you have some pretty important sort of archives online as well. I've read online that Apple Daily from the 2019 Hong Kong democracy movement has been archived on Arweave. I mean, are there other ones? And could you maybe talk about some of the risks? Because, you know, there have been reports before of attacks against Arweave and so forth. The sort of risks that come out because of the type of work that you're doing.
Yeah, so not just Apple Daily, but the Stand news was also uploaded onto Arweave and a number of others. There's also podcasts that are, well, maybe we shouldn't. Anyway, there's information one way or another that's distributed via the system that, yeah, is done so for censorship resistance reasons. In terms of the risks involved, I mean, the system is designed to essentially load balance or arbitrage almost between regulation in different countries. So if a piece of information is illegal globally, then it won't be stored in the network. But if it is illegal locally, then it won't be stored locally. But that doesn't mean that it won't be stored elsewhere. So if a piece of information is illegal in China, then it is replicated in America and Turkey. But if a piece of information is illegal in Turkey, it might be replicated in America and China, and so on. So it's kind of like the web in that way, but it sort of automatically reroutes data to the appropriate place. And then it becomes a question of access. So, I mean, it's funny you say that blockchains are kind of utopian. I absolutely agree that some people see it that way. I see it more as a bulwark against dystopia rather than a creation of a utopia. That was at least what inspired us. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it does to a certain degree, but it also opens up other things around how much ownership is still jurisdiction and legally constructed, and how, in a sense, you know, the two projects that you've shown, you know, Francis, the question was directed to you earlier about IP and how much, in a sense, both systems escape the legal definitions because the ownership is almost very personally tied, and it's tied, you don't really own anything. It's either a sponsorship or you know, it's almost like a belief system of what you, and putting sort of your resources towards your beliefs. If I was to very, very simply reduce it down. We are running out of time. I do have 2 last questions, so if you don't mind, I'll just wrap with those 2. So this one's directed to both of you. Okay, Francis, the question first directed to you, and then I'll end with the one directed to both of you. Francis, what metrics do you use to measure the success of the use of NFTs with museum visitors? Or I guess this is directly.
Yeah, I mean, the question of success is coming from a sort of humanities and arts person. I'm sort of thinking, well, success is you redefine it for each project. So very specifically within my own project, I was thinking about. So actually, I drew from, as I said earlier, this idea of psychological ownership, which of course helpfully comes from the social science background, and of course has then these kind of metric based ideas, and I was really intrigued by that, and particularly we're thinking about how do you create the idea of psychological ownership, and that was through 3 themes: control, investment, and intimacy. So I used those 3 themes to understand, like, as I was speaking with people and as I was analyzing the transcripts, but I don't necessarily use specific metrics, because actually at the end of the day, it didn't really matter whether my project succeeded or not. Like, it was really, as I said, about extending the knowledge and helping us to unpack ideas around ownership, authority, and authenticity. So, but yeah, to kind of, I suppose, in some form of metric idea, was thinking about, well, do they feel like they have control? Have they grown that sense of intimacy? And is there clearly a sense of investment in this process? And how has that then informed the idea of attachment? Taking the idea of kind of, again, psychological attachment and playing around with it in a kind of art and humanities way. So yeah.
Thanks, Francis. No, I mean, this is kind of what's nice about both of you speaking together is, you know, as we talk about ownerships, and also relating back to the question I was kind of trying to get at, which is this idea of global ownership, right? If in a sense something is put on Arweave and it's illegal in one country, but there's a way that we can have, you know, you talk about Arweave as a human archive. We're thinking at a scale no longer that's national or very small community centric. It's really an expansive sense of a social contract or a responsibility, right? And there's something that's a very beautiful idea with that. And I'm going to use that as a pivot to this last question so that we can all release everyone at night and you both onto your own days. This comes from Mr. Lim, and he thanks you for your insights. And he says there are some concerns about the use of NFT not being environmentally friendly. What do both of you think about this concern? So obviously I will add a little tinge onto that, which is if we think about, you know, the climate crisis and we think about a sense of ownership or a sense of accountability that we all have a role to play, but also that, you know, it's not one country's problem more than another's. I'm wondering what comes out of some of these senses of community and ownership that are no longer bounded by central, whether it's a country or so forth. So, you know, this is more apparent with Arweave, but actually, Francis, I could see this even within your project, because so much of this, where the community connection is personal, even though it is the National Museum of Liverpool, you could apply that, you know, those works were not specifically defined to a locale. I mean, I saw a Chinese painting that you were showing, you know. So there's also something there about how our communities, our sense of ownership, our sense of accountability kind of shifts a bit. So going back to Mr. Lim's question, I'm sorry I talked at you in that sense. What do you think about all of this in relation to NFT sort of, the NFTs or blockchain not being environmentally friendly?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in because, of course, I did. So as I said, we did use Ethereum, but that was because there was really no other option. But I think if I was to do this again, you know, I mean, certainly within kind of Europe, Tezos has become a widely used blockchain now for the arts and has grown a really strong artist community. And I personally feel it is a duty for certainly cultural institutions, as we talk much more about the Green Museum and how do we partake in climate activism. It goes against the very essence of all those policies and protocols that are being developed within museums if we just continue to use Ethereum in the state that it is in. The only problem is as well, then there's this kind of problem of the market, and Ethereum is still largely being used, and that becomes a kind of dilemma in itself, you know, because it's also so experimental. But, you know, in theory, it seems sort of straightforward to use the third generation blockchains in this respect. If anything, just for the kind of moral essence of it all, and as you say, the kind of accountability, and to be kind of reflective of what you're saying elsewhere within your institution and your work. You know, your blockchain projects should be no different. But it's easy to say that.
Yeah, I think that so with Arweave, we saw that there's this component of making properly decentralized blockchains, particularly ones that have verifiable timestamps, where you need there to be some form of work that goes into it. And we saw that's also an opportunity in some sense, because you can swap out that work from useless stuff to useful stuff that doesn't hurt the environment. In our case, we swapped out basically burning energy for storing useful data on hard drives. The Bitcoiners would kill me if I didn't mention that something like 80+% of the energy that goes into mining Bitcoin blocks comes from renewable sources. There is some argument to be made that actually these types of mining operations incentivize people to further renewable energy technologies. One of the reasons for that being that some of these technologies don't produce, would you say, consistent power output. And what you can do with a cryptocurrency mining system is essentially use excess output created at the wrong time to gain money from it. So as a producer of energy, you're getting a consistent income. So it allows you to do projects with, you know, forms of energy that are not, you know, reliable enough to just use for the traditional power grid. So there is some element of truth to that, I think, but largely I think we should just replace the work with useful work. There is this interesting part to the question of Tezos, which, yes, is a fairly used blockchain. Same with Solana. Ethereum is also moving in this direction to proof of stake. The problem with proof of stake is that you don't get verifiable timestamps. It's a complex technical issue, but basically you lose the ability to ensure that actually, you know, this transaction that the ledger tells me was written into the chain 10 years ago was in fact written into the chain 10 years ago. You can sort of forge those signatures. It's not quite forging signatures, but you can forge the necessary components to make a chain that looks like that is true without it actually being true. Whereas with a work system like Bitcoin or Ethereum or Arweave, or useful work, you can verify that time has elapsed using the proofs of work you get, which is a really interesting component of the system, particularly from an archiving perspective.
Thank you so much, Sam. Okay, we've run over time by 10 minutes and we've imposed on both of you enough. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you both for your presentations today. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I'm very happy personally, but also just more generally, that, you know, in talking about NFTs, I think both your presentations, even though we talk about NFTs and we talked about Arweave, blockchain, Blockweave, is that we're starting to talk about questions that are much bigger rather than ownership and speculation around financialized assets, right? Or tokens that represent a sort of financial value or that can be speculated in some ways. What we're really actually talking about are almost new ways and modes of being accountable to one another. And in a way, you had a beautiful word for it, which was sort of co-guardianship, Francis, and this whole idea of what this technology can open up in relation to having a greater sense of guardianship that's not tied to a specific country, that's not tied to a specific community, but that we all can kind of contribute in our own ways, basically, if we set up our own archives and tokenize our sort of relationships to important objects. Because first you have to decide whether it's an important object, and then you put in the effort to being part of the community, of conserving it in that sense. So thank you. And this is sort of important because these are things that we're not talking about in relation to this NFT as a speculative financial asset or as an art object that you can own in theory. So thank you both so much for widening the discussion and taking the time to present both projects and both bodies of work that you've been working on, which are very meaningful and very important to, I think, thinking about these technologies of blockchain technologies, especially in regards to museums and public accountability. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for joining us, Sam and Francis, and thank you everyone online for joining us, and thank you for your questions. With that, I'm going to hand over to Kevin, who's going to give us a quick closing on some of our upcoming programs. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, you just heard a very interesting discussion hosted by Kathleen. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition we just heard about using blockchain as a way of capturing history, all the way to using the blockchain as a social token to track participation and a sense of ownership. This is not all that we have. This is very much part one of 3 things that we're about to do here. Following this, on 22nd May, this Sunday, we will actually be having a very interesting webinar, a follow-up. This is going to be called NFT as Revenge Capitalism. And it'll be, we'll see the likes of Max Haven from Lakehead University, Chris Fechner from Tropical Futures, and Zena Zoyer, curator. Sorry if I'm mincing words here, but yeah. We will follow up with a third event, which is in person at the gallery itself. And this is an interesting workshop where it will focus on NFT and the new digital collectivism. We're seeing new art collectives that are forming around the very idea of NFTs, and we'll be listening in on how they're actually working around it or working with it, as well as the challenges and risks associated. So it'll be very exciting. Do continue to join us on these adventures. And in the meantime, because this is our very first webinar, we'd love to hear what you think. Has it been useful? What would you do better and all that? So on screen right now is a QR code you can scan on your phone, or you can click on the link in the chat to give us some feedback. And please, do be frank. We want to improve, we want to do a good show, we want to make sure that it's meaningful for everybody. This will help Kathleen, myself, and the YLab team actually plan future programs that help us as an art and culture institution move forward into the future using technology and various forms of innovation. So we look forward to you continued patronage of our programs, and do stay tuned. If anything, you can visit us at ylab.sg, also sign up for our mailing list and keep in touch. Meanwhile, stay safe, stay cozy, and we'll be in touch. See you soon.
it's up on YouTube.
I should have mentioned that actually this video is online. Share with your friends, tell your folks. It'd be really exciting.
Yeah, so for the next time, maybe we will be able to mention it.
Okay.
Just make a mental note.